Hi, Tina.
Hi, Leah.
I know I always say something's really exciting, but this is super duper exciting because we're in the exact same room.
Yeah, it's a little weird, to be honest.
It
'Cause
is, it's mostly weird because I'm talking into pillows.
yeah, I could look over my monitor and look at you, but instead I'm looking you on Zoom on my screen, although you're only maybe say 5, 6 feet away.
I'm less than that.
Yeah.
I mean, we're the width of a table away. So if there are weird noises in the background, and I'm trying to talk low because we don't want each other's mics to pick us up, and I'm tend to be a very loud person. So yeah, but if there's weird noise in the background, it's because we're in an urban environment.
That's true.
We're in the city.
We're in the city, so usually that comes with the sound of blowers in the background.
Oh, that's the suburbs too, though.
Oh, okay, I'll give you that.
I was just thinking cars might go by,
Mm-hmm.
motorcycles, shoppers sauntering down the avenue.
What's our topic today?
Oh, our topic today is this is the third episode of Good for You, Bad for You. And today we're talking about soy.
Soybeans.
Soybeans, everything soy.
Glycine max.
What?
That's its botanical name, glycine max.
Oh, I I didn't know that.
There's really no need to know that. Can I start this whole thing with a little story?
Please.
Soybeans and I met once upon a time in 1992 in a lab. I did research on soybeans.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So that's why I know it's Latin name because that's what we referred to it.
What was your research on?
I worked for a gentleman, his name is Mark O'Brien, and it was a plant physiology lab. And myself and I was actually an undergraduate. He took me under his wing. It was really nice. And I was at the bench doing work with Indu Sangwan as his assistant at the time. And we ended up finding a novel gene in the soybean plant. And it's a gene that is part of the pathway that soy uses to make hemoglobin.
Crazy.
Yeah. Soy hemoglobin, which is called hemoglobin, so as in legume hemoglobin. So little known factoid, the little roots have nodules. And in those nodules, if you look really closely and pop them open, like even with your finger, a razor blade, they look pink. And they look pink because they have heme in them. So they're high iron in the root nodules of all these legumes. And that's not just soy, it's, peas and any leguminous.
So it's actually in the bean itself. Or just in the nodule in the root?
It's concentrated in the root nodules, and it's a product of a symbiosis between soil bacteria and the plant root itself.
I knew you were going to say that.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Oh.
I don't know why.
Well, don't read my mind. That's really creepy. No, I thought it was amazing. And part of his research, Dr. O'Brien, was trying to figure out who was doing what in these pathways because they couldn't do it alone, right? The bacteria couldn't make heme, the plant couldn't make heme, but when they put them together, they can make hemoglobin. And so, or plant hemoglobin. So yeah, so that was the research project. And as an undergraduate, I ended up having a publication in plant physiology in 1994.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that's why, coming back, that's why it's glycine max is the plant's formal name.
And that's why you're going to be telling us all of the good things about soy.
Yeah, definitely.
But I'm going to start with, they're not necessarily bad things. Some of them are, but I like to start with good things, but this time we're going to start with bad things so that we can end on a good note.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay. So there was really old research out there kind of implying that soy was bad for certain cancers. Mm-hmm. But those studies, from what I can recall, they were observational studies. Mm-hmm. And they've since been disproven.
Are you talking about prior to a certain year, or how far back do you know?
Yeah, I mean, definitely like 90s and maybe like early aughts.
Early aughts. I like that. Yes.
The thousands, the 2000s.
Yeah. You're right. And most of it was A lot of the research, as research generally goes, was in animals and in particular rodents. And well, I'll let you go into the negative stuff, and then I'll tell you why rodents are not a good model to study.
No, I think you should share it.
Yeah,
Sure.
just go for it.
Yeah.
All right. So the issue with rodents in studying isoflavones in particular is in how they process them compared to a human being. So when you and I eat, now isoflavones are these compounds and they have actual names of molecules called diadzine and genistein. In any case, when you and I eat these molecules, we conjugate them. And that just means that we basically modify them slightly before they get absorbed. So we take them in one way and they get modified in our gut and we absorb them and they look slightly different with slightly different action in the body, and molecular actions. And so when you do that to a rodent, when you give them isoflavones, they don't do that so well. We conjugate the isoflavones almost completely. And depending on the strain of rodent, on the actual experimental strain in the lab, they are very inefficient. So they have unconjugated genistein, unconjugated diadzine in their circulation. And the net effect is a completely different molecule. Basically, you're studying a different molecule than a conjugated molecule. And so the effects that it has in rodents does not translate to humans simply because you're not even really studying the same.
It's not the
molecule.
same thing. Once they ingest it, it becomes something different than when humans ingest it.
Yeah. So they have higher levels of unconjugated isoflavones. We conjugate it 100, nearly completely before it goes into circulation. And so you're really studying two different things and they have two different actions. And it really led us down a false thought of how estrogenic these isoflavones were because we had only rodent data all the way up to 2009. Really, we had very little information on, we had some observational data, but we didn't have a lot of information, at least in people with a history of cancer in particular. I'm thinking of that actually. I'm not thinking of like intake for prevention of first diagnoses of various cancers. I'm thinking about
prevention of recurrence.
Prevention of recurrence data. We did not have much of that. So we were very careful. Of course, we used the rodent data because that's what we had.
And it was very confusing because around 2009 was when I started my oncology training. And it was this back and forth whether or not to recommend soy to our patients because of the information that was out there. And it was like, oh, well, if someone grows up eating soy, it has one effect. But if you just start eating it when you're like menopausal, and I think that a lot of that was because of the fact that people eat soy isolates. Mm-hmm. And so we're probably going to go back and forth on the good and the bad, but soy isolates and whole soy food, as we've mentioned before, are completely different things. And kind of jumping back and sticking with the bad is that there's like soy in everything that we eat.
Yeah.
I feel like, and it's not always used like for its soy properties, but I feel like as Americans, it's kind of like, oh, well, A is good for you. And so let's put A in everything, and it just gets to be a lot. Mm-hmm. So there is soy added to, whether it's soy flours or, soybean oil, there's a lot of soy in things. And the soybean oil and the soy lecithin they don't necessarily have the same proteins mm-hmm. because they're so processed.
Right.
But there is a lot of soy in our food, but that's processed food, but also the things that we eat, whether it's poultry, the eggs from the chickens, animals are fed soybeans as well. So there's a lot of soy out there. And I don't know.
Well, that translates to something that you and I have talked about before. And that's like so many things, if you get bombarded with any kind of protein over and over again, that protein, which is also could be considered an antigen, can stimulate the immune system in ways we don't want, right? Like allergies.
Right. So that's the other thing is that it is on like that top 8 list of common food allergies, like milk, egg, peanuts, wheat, fish, nuts. I don't know. I've lost count. And soy's on that list. Mm-hmm. So it is one of the common allergies. And when I was just kind of checking my about the food allergies, like how common it is. Apparently, like half of infants who have a cow milk allergy, half of them also have a sensitivity to soy.
Oh, yeah.
Which I thought was fascinating, because isn't that usually what they end up getting substituted with, some sort of a soy formula? If someone has a cow milk allergy and they're doing a formula, then they get substitute, they get
sure.
soy formula. So I don't know. I think that soy is good. I used to, and I'm probably biased because I have a soy allergy. So, so there's that. But I used to eat soy, and I enjoyed tofu and whole food soy. And I also enjoyed my soy bar isolate type, energy bars, or those products that you buy that are also just soy protein.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't necessarily think that that's the kind of soy we're supposed to be eating. So my bad about soy in terms of how it impacts us directly is just that there are people who have soy sensitivities and they might not know it.
Yeah. Yeah, very easy. It's easy to have if you are sensitive to something that's really pervasive in the diet, it's really hard to track it, right? So until you go what is your sensitivity? What happens when you eat it?
Well, that's what's really strange is I was tested for food allergies. It was the skin prick test, and this was in my 20s. And it came back very positive for soy. Like, I didn't have any symptoms. And the allergist I went to in New York was like, I'm not going to test you. You don't have any food allergy symptoms. And I was like, just test me. And so soy came back like massively reactive. And I'm like, that's weird. I mean, I eat soy all the time. And back then it was like tofu, because I don't know if there were all of those like energy bars.
Right.
So I remember being out at a restaurant and I was eating Japanese food with a girlfriend, and they're those little soy dumplings. I don't remember what they're called, but they're really tasty.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was talking, like I started slurring, and it was like my tongue was kind of maybe in the way. Maybe it was a little swollen. I don't know what was going on, but she noticed. She's like, "You're slurring." And we weren't drinking sake or anything. There was no beer or sake involved. So that was the first thing I noticed. And then the other thing that I noticed, which I don't think it's allergy related, but I noticed that this is so strange. It affected my mood.
Oh,
Like, it affected me to where it affected, I guess, hormonally. I know that's a strange thing to say.
what direction did your mood go in?
It was like I was PMSing.
Oh,
It would happen fast. Like, I would actually, and it would happen. This is when I started eating those bars. I would have a bar, and then afterwards I was like, oh, am I getting my period? My breasts are tender. Like, I would almost instantly have like tender breasts and get irritable.
wow.
So weird. I know it's a very strange reaction.
It's unusual, that's for sure.
It's very unusual. And I was like, I didn't associate it until finally one day I was like, okay, I'm just going to like not do soy. Like, I'm just going to cut soy out. Like, I don't feel like I have a reaction, but I'm just going to cut it out of my diet. And then I got this box of soy bars, and I was sharing them with everyone in the office. And I was like, I'm just going to have one because they look really good. And I had one, and immediately I had breast sensitivity and mood changes.
Mm. Well, if that's really, I really haven't heard that before. I mean, I don't doubt you one bit. Because I think food sensitivities can affect mood. I mean, I know that the one I hear the most, of course, is gluten. Immediately, like right after eating it, some people will feel different. But yeah, I'd never heard it with soy. So that's fascinating.
It's almost as if it affected me hormonally. And I do know I've had friends who were being worked up for hormone issues. And then and the recommendations were like, oh, you're going to have to do these procedures or whatever, to deal with these hormone issues. And then it turned out that, oh no, you just have a lot of soy isolate in your diet. Stop doing the soy protein powder, stop doing the bars. And then the hormone issues resolved.
Interesting. Yeah. And I wonder if it is a little bit of a concentration issue too, like the isolate being much, much more detrimental or more likely to give symptoms than a than just a whole food. But you're saying even whole food affected you. So
Well, it was, I mean, it was the whatever the dumpling things were made out of. I mean, we were eating a lot of foods. And so, but
yeah.
that just kind of, the slur was the first thing that we noticed. And I was like, that's odd. Um, but who knows? And it could have all just been in my head. But but that's my soy story.
Well, yeah. So let's talk about that. So soy is a common allergen. So people do need to be mindful of that. So it's right up there next to dairy and wheat or eggs or, you know, some of the
Nuts and fish.
Yeah. So being mindful of that. But if someone's not actually allergic, I always like to, remind people it is a bean. It's just a bean, because there is a contingent of people out there who just think soy is right next to arsenic on the, bad for you list. And I think that's usually overblown. Like soy is inherently contains compounds that are just not compatible with life, kind of thing. So I think that that's a little alarmist for a bean.
Well, I think there is that faction that, the anti-lectin people.
Mm-hmm.
But lectins can easily be reduced by soaking a bean and by cooking a bean.
Mm-hmm.
And that's typically how most beans are prepared.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can look at traditional methods. I mean, most traditional methods will soak the beans overnight or even sprout them, so there is because there's a lot of beans eaten around the world. I mean, soybean happens to be one that we're talking about today that's extraordinarily high in isoflavones compared to any other bean. But traditional preparations generally would you say that's accurate? Traditional preparations generally will at least make it more digestible and maybe tamp down the
soy traditionally is eaten fermented.
Yes.
And so that's, again, a completely different animal if a soybean was an animal. So, but yeah. So the one thing that the last thing I want to mention in terms of like the bad thing about soy is it, and this is more on the global sense, like we mentioned in previous episodes, where it's the environmental impact. There's a lot of deforestation in order to grow soy. Soy is grown in, I think, the US, Brazil, and Argentina, I think, are the three countries that produce like 80% of soy.
Okay.
And so there are issues with it being a water intensive crop as well as the deforestation aspect. And so that's not such a favorable thing on the global sense.
Yeah. And it goes back to your point of it's everywhere. I mean, it's the oils are used, the protein is used, and now even the leg hemoglobin is used. These burgers that are putting in plant-based, when those burgers look bloody, but they're a plant-based, that's probably soy leg hemoglobin that they're using. I
think they use other peas too, because some of those products are, because I've
pea derived.
Yeah, I think it's like pea derived too.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some positives.
Yes. Okay.
And I do know, I know a lot of the information around soy and breast cancer. I don't know as much. And I think it's really well studied around breast cancer. And I feel like that's where a lot of the conversations I have about soy are with people trying to prevent breast cancer, or a history of breast cancer, or currently diagnosed with breast cancer. So that a lot of my knowledge kind of centers around that because of that.
And there still is a lot out there. If you do a quick Google search, I mean, there is a lot out there of people still saying that soy is bad. They also say flax seeds are bad if you're going through treatment for breast cancer. So really know the source that you're looking at. And if somebody tells you that, definitely, question their sources.
Well, yeah, because if you're using old information, I have to say, I started, my residency was back in 2000. And I can remember till 2010 telling people to avoid soy, right? With around breast cancer. And, just so we're clear, I'm going to talk about breast cancer in a general sense when I talk about it. Estrogen receptor positive people are most concerned, but, there's some data on estrogen negative breast cancers too, and its outcomes in people who have had a history of estrogen negative breast cancer and consume soy. So I'm going to touch on that too. But the first 10 years of my career, I said, don't eat it, mostly because we had no evidence in either direction. And what we had in the animal studies looked like it could be detrimental. It wasn't until 2009 that the first studies came out. And then they just came out, boom, boom, boom. 2009, 2010, studies came out of China. They came out of America. They even came out of Canada. And they were looking at, observational studies where they were looking at women who had a history of breast cancer. And here's where it gets interesting. Putting all these studies together, and there is the breast cancer pooling project where they took all this data and pooled it together. Shortly after it came out, like 2000, I don't know what year that came out, 2012, 13, something like that. But when you pool all the information, there are certain things that are given. So without teasing all this information out and boring anyone who happens to be listening to our podcast, let me just get right to the chase. A serving of soy a day in all of these studies. And we're pushing, we're 18,000 plus women cumulatively in all these studies, various, ethnicities. A serving a day was never detrimental for any group of women with breast cancer, ER positive or negative, hormone positive or negative, premenopausal or postmenopausal. So let's just get that out now. Like, as far as observational data goes, there was no studies have said whole soy plant-based foods at a serving a day, and roughly 10 grams is what I think I remember the serving being. We could get it right down to the isoflavone content. Too much looked like it could be detrimental. So people who kind of went really, really, really high, there could be a point where you eat too much soy and it becomes detrimental. My guess is that has to do with, how much of the food isoflavones you're eating, and the effect it has might be different at high dose rather than low and medium. But the first thing to get out is that it's not detrimental, and there could be some people who actually derive benefit. That's the other piece is the studies didn't all match, and they didn't concur on that part. So I'm not going to say any particular subpopulation, but soy has other roles, and it's anti-angiogenic, which means it can possibly stop new blood vessel growth, which is necessary for tumors to form and to grow larger. It also can affect cells by encouraging them to go into like a self-destructive process, the apoptosis of cells. And then some of these pathways within the cells that are used for proliferation, they're called signal transduction pathways. Some of our targeted agents in our small molecules that people take orally. When people take a pill, they're generally taking these drugs that go right into the cell and block pathways. And soy does that to a certain extent. So it has other roles besides just this kind of estrogen, anti-estrogen idea around soy. So maybe some of that weighed into the evidence. But there was in every study, there were certain populations that had a decrease in the risk of recurrence or a decrease in their mortality rate. So this is all out there. This is, what are we in, 2021? So we've got a good decade plus of evidence now. And the studies, none of them have refuted this. In other words, anything that's ongoing, we've never seen any detriment. And if anything, there's always been kind of subpopulations in these studies that find benefit. Like I said, it's not always the same subpopulation. That's the issue, is that if it was constant, postmenopausal women with ER positive have benefit in one study, and then another study will show that ER negative population has benefit. And just, I don't know if we've ever qualified. ER means estrogen receptor. I'm sorry, I didn't say that before I used all that abbreviation.
So I just don't want people to feel left out. Like if they're sitting there like, oh, I can't have these benefits of soy and I have a history of breast cancer. Right. There are alternatives like other legumes.
Yeah, that's a good point, because isoflavones happen in other foods too, right? So it's not as high a concentration, but you're right. Other legumes will have benefit. And, a lot of this also relies on the gut and what is inhabiting the gut. What's the microbiota of the gut? Because that's really probably why there's a lot of inconsistent information in these studies is there metabolites made from the isoflavones or even the lignans on the beans, the metabolites from the bacteria. So the bacteria takes in the isoflavone, creates a molecule like equal is one molecule that's gotten a lot of research interest. And there's either people who make equal or they don't. And then that's EQUOL, equal. And that molecule is made by some people and not by others. And it does seem to be made in higher amounts in cultures who are used to seeing soy throughout their life from the time they're children onward. So a lot of Asian countries that use a lot of soy-based diets will be more likely to be equal producers than non-producers.
And what does the equal do?
It itself has some anti-cancer effects, so especially in the realm of breast cancer. So that's been pointed to as a molecule that could be responsible for some of the benefits. Because I didn't mention this, but the data is not inconsistent at all when it comes to prevention with some soy in the diet. So when people are growing up, like young women and teenagers, having a serving, just adding some soy to the diet, assuming they're not allergic to it, can be beneficial for just primary prevention of cancers, breast cancer in particular. Again, the reason I'm saying breast cancer is not because it's because I'm most familiar with that information, and it's the most abundant information around this, around soy intake.
I will add, even though I was supposed to be on the bad side, I will add something to the good side, is that soy is really supportive to bone health and to cardiovascular health.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I do recognize that I'm not just down on soy altogether, but I do recognize that it does have a lot of health benefits, including like what we talked about with hot flashes, right? Replacing some of your diet with soy and plant-based. I think every episode, are we going to talk plant-based diet? I feel like that's kind of happening here.
Yeah. Well, it is always relevant, isn't it? And we do all eat every day. So we may as well just keep saying it.
We often think about food.
If we haven't just eaten, we probably are about to eat. Hey, can I do one more little, one of the reasons that this is a difficult to track thing? One, when you're doing observation studies, people are doing other things besides just eating the soy. They tend to be, if they're eating a high plant-based diet, especially in the United States, they might be taking care of themselves more, right? They might be exercising more. Maybe they're more conscientious about eating their vegetables.
True.
So observational studies always have this as something that we have to control for, or at least look at all those things that can confound the data. And the other thing that makes soy difficult and estrogen receptor research in general difficult is estrogen receptors, there's alpha and there's beta, right? Inside cells.
Right. And we did cover this in a previous episode, but for someone who has not listened to any other episode besides this, let's do a review.
So, and I'll do a review and I'll go just a smidge deeper. So within the cell, within its cytosol, floating around are estrogen receptor, alpha and beta receptors. And so the estrogen molecule or phytoestrogen or whatever's going to bind that alpha or beta receptor, now an alpha, they have to bind together. You need two of them in order to get to the nucleus. And that's where the estrogen receptor has its action, is we're actually within the nucleus of the cell on the DNA. And so alpha can be bound together, and now they can go into the nucleus as a duo, right? Or it can be alpha beta that bind together and go into the nucleus as a duo, or it can be beta beta. So now you've got actually three different possibilities. And so you can see how quickly the data gets, confusing, because estrogen can bind, preferentially binds to alpha. Tamoxifen certainly preferentially, it only blocks alpha. Soy and all these foods are beta preferential. So I'm saying this not to confuse everyone, but to say, if you are confused, it is inherently confusing because there are so many possibilities every time anything estrogenic goes into a cell. There's at least three scenarios right there that could happen, right? You could have alpha, beta beta, or alpha beta. And then it finally goes into the nucleus and has an effect. And that's why we don't always know the effect of agents until we pan back and see what happens in humans. And this is why I think looking at the data in humans is always, always, always really important. And as soon as you have human data, you stop looking at the animal data and you start really concentrating on the human data, because dishes mean very little.
Right. And dishes, by dishes, you mean when you see something that says in vitro.
In
So an in
vitro.
vitro study versus an in vivo study. And then with in vivo studies, then you have to look at animal versus human.
Yes. And mice are not human, and rodents are not the same metabolism as people. And so, it's the best we have. But then when we have people data, we stick with the people.
But the people data is rarely controlled. I mean, it's hard to control like food studies in humans because there are so many other factors.
You're right. Unless they do a really tightly controlled intervention study where they, tell people, here's your meals.
Here are your meals, and you are going to live in this controlled environment.
Right. Here's the biosphere we're going to put you in. No.
Biosphere too. Yeah. Oh, that's a whole nother story. Well, cool. Anything else that you want to share that is really good? Oh, you know what we do need to share, because I did touch on the environmental impact. And part of that is also the use of pesticides on soy. It is such a highly farmed product here in the US. Is if one is going to imbibe in soy, if one is going to eat soy, then definitely favor the organic soy, like the organic tofu or other soy products.
Totally agree. I think that's most important, especially formative years, like anything else. I mean, I really think from 0 to 18 or 20 is when you dig deep and do everything you possibly can not to ingest glyphosate or any other pesticides, herbicides, things like that, because at least there's preliminary information in animals where the glyphosate in particular, which is that Roundup and Roundup Ready plants and all that kind of stuff. Glyphosate may structurally change ligaments and tendons as we develop. It does that in some animals, certainly. And so I know it's expensive. Here's the practical side of me going, well, some people can't afford to do all organic, right? And you have to pick and choose what can you afford and what you can't afford. And when I say dig deep, that's what I mean, like prioritize avoidance of glyphosate, particularly in children. I think that's true throughout life, but I know that people have to make hard decisions based on what they can do. So yeah, I totally agree. I think it's organic is the way to avoid it completely. And soy is heavily sprayed here anyways, in the States.
Right. All right. Well, I think that's a really good kind of mix of information on soy. I hope it's not too confusing for anybody. I hope
it's not too negative. I didn't want to come off too negative.
No, and you didn't. I started with negative, so I think there's like this negative vibe out there, but I think you kind of brought it up.
Oh, good.
That soy, it's not so bad.
It's just a bean, man. It's just a bean.
Oh, and that reminds me of the song that I chose that I sent to you.
Oh, yeah.
Was the soy song, and it wasn't a song about soybeans. It has nothing to do with beans or soy whatsoever. But the title of the song is No estoy tan mal, which translated means I'm not so bad. And so that's what our soybean song was. And that song, if you care, is by Gabby Moreno, who is one of my favorite artists. I hope if she found out, this is not an insult, but it was just the title. I'm not so bad.
The soybean is singing.
I'm not that bad. Yeah. So that's just kind of what came to me. So that if you're following along with the songs that I'm picking for each episode, we'll see how long that lasts. Speaking of something that we tried with the last pod, now is the time for our moment of woo.
Oh, I wish I want to cue the background music. Moment of woo.
We have to come up with background music. Something woo-woo.
Yeah.
So moment of woo is where we talk about something. How are you explaining it?
Something that is bantered about online and becomes popular, but has little or absolutely no science or evidence behind it.
Perfect. That's a perfect description. So today's moment of woo for this pod, good for you, bad for you, is bulletproof coffee.
All right.
So Bulletproof Coffee allegedly was started by the founder of the company who learned of yak butter being used in, I thought it was coffee.
Okay.
And this is supposed to help with energy and have all of these health benefits. These really aren't proven in any way that I could find. When I looked up kind of the origin story, the yak butter in use in Tibet, they use a fermented tea, a fermented black tea mixed with the yak butter. And yak butter is different than any butter that you're going to find in the Western US. It is higher in conjugated linoleic acids.
Oh.
It's just a different makeup. And so when people mix the coconut oil or other MCT oil and grass-fed butter, you're not getting yak butter. It's not the same thing. There also may be benefit to people who live in higher environments, so where there's lower oxygen.
Oh, okay. So high elevations.
High elevations.
All right.
Yeah. But the most fascinating thing, because what I started looking up Bulletproof Coffee, and then of course, me and my rabbit holes, I looked at the coffee origin. And there was use of butter and coffee traditionally, like forever ago.
Oh, yeah?
So coffee originated in Ethiopia. And there is a use of ground coffee beans and a type of ghee, clarified butter, that's used in Ethiopia. And it was made into a paste. And the paste was rolled into these little balls. And the balls were carried if somebody was, whether they were a soldier or, somebody who had to like go long distances, or they were just used for energy and stamina.
The original energy balls.
The original energy balls, and kind of like the original Bulletproof Coffee.
Mm-hmm.
So in no way am I saying to go out and do this. This was just kind of me trying to explore, what is this Bulletproof Coffee? And I went to PubMed and I found a couple of studies that are being looked at up in Canada. And that there really was not anything showing benefit.
All right. Well, I really like that moment of woo. I didn't know why people were putting oil slicks on top of their coffee. So now I know.
And, I've tried it and it's pretty tasty.
Yeah.
It's like a very rich latte, but I would definitely not recommend doing it all the time. And, there is some thought of it having more sustained energy. The fat is filling you up. So if you have it on an empty stomach, you're fuller longer. So maybe if you're, trying to do some sort of intermittent fasting,
that makes sense.
It might decrease your cravings for a lot of breakfast foods, but
that makes sense.
Yeah. So, but in terms of true health benefits, that's the unknown.
Jury is out. So each person. So can we ask people just to go to our Instagram or something and tell us if they felt like $1 million when they do it compared to when they don't do it?
Yeah, maybe I'll put a post. So keep an eye out for a post on how do you feel about Bulletproof Coffee?
Love it.
And speaking of Instagram, I put links to things that we talk about on our Pinterest page. All of our social media is under The Cancer Pod. So at The Cancer Pod. So whether it's Pinterest, Instagram, or Twitter, which I'm not very active on, but so check us out on social media.
Yeah, and we'll link to the actual studies on Pinterest, right? That's when.
Yeah, I linked to various studies.
Cool.
So if I can find those studies that I mentioned, then I will post them.
Sounds good. And this was the third of our Good for You, Bad for You series.
This is the last one. Exactly.
Last pea in a pod?
The last pea in our pod.
Even though our symbol is actually a lotus pod.
It's a lotus pod, but and there are a lot of seeds in a lotus pod. So, but yes, this is the conclusion of Good for You, Bad for You. My name is Dr. Leah Sherman.
And I'm Dr. Tina Kaiser.
And this has been the Cancer Pod.
Thanks again for listening to us. Don't forget to subscribe.
Thanks for listening to the Cancer Pod. Remember to subscribe, review, and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media for updates. And as always, this is not medical advice. These are our opinions. Talk to your doctor before changing anything related to your treatment plan. The Cancer Pod is hosted by me, Dr. Leah Sherman, and by Dr. Tina Kaiser. Music is by Kevin MacLeod. See you next time.